So today is technically our last week of lecture, since as we kind of are beginning to close out the semester, next week we're going to be doing individual conferencing for the final paper. So today we're really going to get into just discussing kind of how your research process went, and then beginning to formulate the arguments you're making, specifically creating your claims and creating an argumentative thesis statement, before on Wednesday we specifically get into specifically drafting the argument in general. So today, as I kind of already said, we're going to talk about that prospectus, and then we're going to talk about strategies to develop our claims and then write that argumentative thesis statement. So to begin with, did you guys have any questions about the prospectus, the research, or even the final paper as we get into it? Any questions or any concerns or any issues you guys had? Okay. If you do have any, just let me know so we can address them. So to start with today's discussion, since you guys have finished the research portion, so basically the project portion of your arguments, which is really breaking down what argument you want to make, finding your sources, and figuring out your audience and how to appeal to them. Before we get into kind of getting into outlining the claims themselves, I wanted to have some time for you guys to share your perspective. So really, we're going to get into small groups of 3 to 4 people. And within these groups, you want to take turns sharing the research that you completed and the plan that you have. So you can either just talk about it and discuss what you've presented. You could even share your screens in your groups to really give your classmates a sense. And within your small groups, after each person has shared, you want to give feedback. So as a group, like, what stood out to you about what your peer presented, their plan, if you have any suggestions about what they should include or what they should think about before they create their arguments, that's what we're going to take some time to really focus on within these small groups. So we're going to take about 20 minutes. So that way each person has about 5 minutes to share what they've planned, as well as get that feedback from their classmates. If we need a little bit more time, we can do so. And as you guys are working, I will be, of course, jumping between the different groups just to check in or give you some of my own feedback or answer any questions you may have. But any questions about what we're going to be doing in our small breakout sessions? Okay, so just let me know. You can always summon me to your group as we do that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we can get into those breakout sessions. So now we're going to talk about strategies to develop strong claims, because of course, as we're starting to outline our arguments and put together kind of what evidence we want to use, what points we want to make in order to kind of create that overall argument, there are a lot of different things that we need to consider, especially depending on the specific argument that you're making. Because of course, one thing to keep in mind is that your claims are really going to be dependent on your argument, because of course, those are the building blocks. So not everyone is going to have all of the claim types, and not everyone is going to have even the same claims within this essay. So really it comes down to the 3 types of claims and figuring out which type of claims really work for the argument that you're making. So as we've talked about previously, we have claims of fact, claims of value, and claims of policy. So when we're thinking about creating these claims, there are kind of general things that we want to be aware of, especially in terms of figuring out what variety we want, or even the lack of variety, if we think of some of the articles that we've read over the course of the semester. So one thing to note for presenting claims, which let me start our annotation. So presenting claims of fact, For most arguments, I would say probably 99% of arguments, you are going to want to have some sort of claim of fact, primarily because this is the most general type of claim. And of course, typically, they're the easiest to get the audience to agree with. So when we're thinking about presenting claims of fact, we really want to be strategic in terms of how we're wording those claims, because of course that really matters, especially in terms of making sure that we're showing our confidence and that we're making sure that there isn't too much wiggle room. Primarily because since we're presenting it as facts, we don't want it to be too passive where our audience who is more inclined to oppose us or oppose those facts would kind of be able to disagree, essentially. So when we think about claims of facts, these ones are going to be statements that you want to make. And when we think about that, the number one thing you want to avoid doing is you want to avoid using first person when we're making claims of fact. Any guesses as to why for these statements we would avoid using first person? And that's something we've talked about previously. What do you guys think? Yeah, to be objective, right? Because of course, when we think about the difference between facts is, right, opinions are not facts. So if we present something as our opinion, it's going to be turning it away from a claim for our opposition and more into, well, that's just your opinion, and I don't have to agree with your opinion, which is the last thing we want. So within these statements, like as a general rule, right, we want to avoid that first person just so it's going to be as general as possible. And how we're presenting this is, right, making it kind of as definitive. So if we think about like one way that you can focus on creating this statement is to really pay attention to your verbs and using as concrete of verbs as possible. So when we're thinking about like claims of fact, the most common verbs that we have would be the to be verb, which we talked about previously. So that would be if we think of the conjugations of that. So is, are, were, etc. Because this, of course, is presenting it as a state of being. Therefore, there is inherently less wiggle room because it just is, essentially. However, depending on the claim, depending on the argument that you're using, sometimes using the to be conjugation doesn't necessarily work. So what other verbs can you use when we're presenting claims of facts? Any ideas? What other verb options can we have to give you guys variety? So it's really going to depend on what you want to emphasize. So they is a pronoun. So if we think about that would get into your subjects. So in terms of like verbs, like if we think about other verb options, right, we want to have that confidence, the definitiveness of that statement. So we could do will or would. So something will happen or would happen. If you think about other verbs, any other ones come to mind? So the other verb options would be active verbs. And when we're using active verbs here, my recommendation would be to use with adverbs to emphasize those points. So if we think about kind of an example to break this down, we really want to root this, well, we can root this example in like a specific issue. So any volunteers about a specific kind of what you're focusing on that we can use as our class example for illustrating how we can use active verbs? Gender stereotypes. So so say for our class example, we are making the argument that gender stereotypes should be, or kind of, what argument do we want to make about them? So there's so many different maybe are detrimental to society, therefore they should be destroyed. Let's be real strong here. So I'm making the argument that gender stereotypes are detrimental to society as a whole, so we need to destroy them. So now in terms of how I'm presenting my claims about them, if I want to present a claim about gender stereotypes using an active verb, I have a lot of options because, of course, thinking about that thesis statement, I do have strong language. So detrimental, destroyed, they're very negative in terms of connotations. So typically that means that my claims of fact about gender stereotypes should be negative as well. So one way that I can do this would be gender stereotypes always hurt individuals who don't fit them. So if we think of that as a claim example, right? This is an example of a claim of fact. And my verb here is hurt, which is an active verb, because somebody can complete that action. Somebody can hurt another person or hurt themselves. So the adverb is always. So the adverbs are words, adjectives essentially that are modifying the verb. So by using always hurt individuals, I'm changing that claim of fact and I'm making it more definitive. Right, so there isn't really any wiggle room, right? There isn't a situation where they wouldn't hurt individuals who don't fit the gender stereotypes. So I'm presenting this as a very definitive fact. So that's what can be really helpful when we use active verbs with adverbs when it comes to claims of fact, because of course it adds that confidence and that certainty similar to how meta discourse does. So if we think about like the different adverbs that you can use, there are a lot of different adverbs. Right, so I have always here. We could also use like must. So I could do gender stereotypes must hurt individuals who don't fit them, and that would still make sense. Right, we could do certainly. What other adverbs come to mind? If we think of like passive adverbs, we can do may, perhaps. But any other ones come to mind? If we think about the most common adverbs, really and very. So gender stereotypes really hurt individuals who don't fit them. So we can use any of those adverbs in order to emphasize that point to make it a more concrete claim of fact. In terms of language that we would want to avoid when we're presenting claims of fact, so if we think of verbs that we never want to use, we would never use could or can. Typically when we're presenting a claim of fact, any guess as to why? Because those are really passive, right? If it could, so gender stereotype could hurt individuals who don't fit them, right? It's presenting it as a possibility, but it's not as definitive. So it's not going to be as appealing or strong for the argument that I'm making. So could, can, right? They are verbs that can essentially take away from that fact itself and take away from the argument that we're making. So any questions about like the strategies for how we word claims of fact? Or what we should kind of focus on versus not focus on? Okay, awesome. So if any questions come up, just let me know. So our next type of claim is a claim of value, which is probably our second most common claim type. And depending on the argument you're making, you may have like a few claims of value or multiple claims of value. It really just depends on kind of how you want to emphasize the points that you're making about that argument. So remember, claims of value, they're claims that something, right, is good or bad, or right or wrong. So when we think about the language that we're using, right, connotation really matters. So that's something we really want to emphasize when we're using a claim of value, because of course, claims of value doesn't necessarily have to state that gender stereotypes are bad, right? We can just use a connotation that makes that connection, right? And of course, when we think about claims of value, when in terms of connotations, one thing that really matters for this is how we're engaging our audience. Because of course, when we're thinking about making an argument with a claim of value, right, typically one thing that you want to be really aware of is how is the audience going to respond to that claim of value, and how we can word it in such a way that's going to make it more accessible towards them, or they're going to agree with it. Because of course, when we think about values, if we think about morals, morals are relative depending on the person and their background. So we don't necessarily want to place the value onto that audience, because that can be really difficult in terms of getting them to accept it, or getting them to kind of trying to think of how to explain it, but essentially reject it, essentially, I guess what we could say. So in terms of how we're engaging with that audience, one thing is when we're presenting claims of value, you want to avoid generalizing the audience within these claims. And of course, when we think about rhetorical strategies, right, that would be really getting into identification, as well as commonplaces. So we really want to be careful with how we're wording that, so that it's going to be as acceptable for the audience as possible. So if we think about like language that we can do this, which we go back to our argument example, what claim could we make that would be a claim of value? For the example that gender stereotypes are detrimental to society, therefore they should be destroyed. What would be a claim that we can center our example on? Any ideas? What do you guys think? Especially, it doesn't have to be gender stereotypes as the subject. So it could be more specific about female or male gender stereotypes, masculinity, femininity. Causing mental health issues. Yeah, so if we think about how we can word our example, then we could have the example that, say, the pressure to be masculine causes mental health issues. And how can we turn that into a value? Because right now, if you think about the verb causes, right, that is a claim of fact. So how can we turn it into a claim of value? We can maybe change it to pressuring others to be masculine is wrong because it causes mental health issues. So we can have that in terms of having, if we think of this as a statement, that emphasis on is wrong being that value of what we're presenting. Is there another way we can word that? So you could do is good, is bad, is right or wrong, but we don't necessarily have to have that is, right? We can change the wording in terms of what is creating that value. So if we think of like another way that we convert the same claim is we can just change like a verb that's emphasizing wrong. So what we could do is we can turn maybe wrong into an adverb. So we could say masculine stereotypes wrongly pressure young men, causing mental health issues. So I'm changing it, so wrongly pressure, or so now I'm presenting that as an adverb describing the pressure. So it's still that value. And that gives me sentence variety where I'm not using to be, the state of being verb, in every claim that I'm making. So wrongly pressures, or even like if we think about, which this is very much spelled wrong. If we want to do kind of right or wrong, good or bad, right? Could be appropriately, could be another verb, adverb that could work for a different context. Yeah. So just thinking about how we can frame the verb in order to create it and turn it into a value. One thing to note in terms of the differences between these two, the biggest difference would be that with claims of fact, it is a statement, and then claims of value, it's a more complex sentence. So it isn't necessarily just a statement itself. And then claims of policy is the least common type of claim, which we've seen when we've broken down different arguments, primarily because its usage is very specific for different, well, its usage is very dependent on the argument that's being made. So if we think about claims of policy, right, it really has to do with the scale of the arguments you are making. Because of course, claims of policy are something should or shouldn't be done in terms of rules, in terms of laws, right? So if we think about the scale of the argument, right, that has to go between, is your argument centered on persuading an individual and what an individual should do versus a group of people versus society at large. So depending on that scale really limits and really changes how you would want to present a claim of policy, primarily because when we think about what should or shouldn't be done, right, we don't want to put too much pressure on an individual to change society if you're just trying to persuade that individual to agree or disagree with something. However, if you are putting the pressure on society, you can have that call to arms. So the biggest thing in terms of if you have a claim of policy is the verb typically is limited to should. Primarily because you are telling somebody to do something. So should or shouldn't. And of course, with that in mind, right, if we think about our example argument, one kind of claim that we could make is like society should, or even actually, let's think, we could even limit it to parents should stop teaching gender stereotypes to to children. So I would have that scale, and of course, I'm just telling that group of people to do something or whether or not to do something. When we're thinking about strategies for appealing to an audience with the claim of policy, right, one thing that you want to be cautious of is, in most cases, we do not have second person. When making this claim, any guesses as to why we would avoid second person when we're making claims of policy? Like, why would second person be really problematic? So you should stop teaching gender stereotypes to children. Could be an example. Any guesses as to why? Yeah, it could feel like an attack. So that is really why we would avoid second person, because it could attack the audience. So they feel like you're not understanding them or where they're coming from. And it could even, if the audience doesn't feel like they're doing that, then of course they can just discredit the points you're making just because they'd be like, well, you don't understand where I'm coming from, therefore I'm not going to find you credible. So that is something we really want to avoid, especially in claims of policy. In terms of how you're wording it, if you do want to use a different pronoun, right, one that you could do that can work really well as an appeal is you could use we. So we could use first person inclusive as the subject, because that can be really effective in terms of not attacking them, but putting yourself as the author with that audience you're talking about. So you're no longer attacking them, but you're now saying, I need to do this as well. So that inclusivity can be really good in terms of appealing to the audience when you're making a claim of policy. So we should do this. That's often why when we're thinking claims of policy, whenever we have a call to action, right, that typically is falling into a claim of policy and using that first person plural pronoun, we. And that can be really effective. Any questions about the different language and things we want to consider when we're using and creating claims of fact versus claims of value and claims of policy? Anything need clarification, or were there any kind of wordings that you were considering that you want to check to see kind of where that would fit here? Yeah, so companies must update policies that no longer enforce gender stereotypes. So that would definitely work as a claim of policy because you're telling them that they should do this. So the must is really important there in terms of using that adverb to add certainty to it, and more that as a meta discourse is really important because it's not giving the wiggle room of like, well, they don't necessarily need to. It's like, no, they have to do this. So that would work well as a claim of policy. And that would be more bigger scale. So it'd be a group of people would be who you're focusing on within that situation. So of course, for that one, it's natural. You wouldn't use we, that inclusive. Any other ones or any other questions? Okay, so just let me know if any come up. Let me clear this briefly. So moving forward, right, one thing to know when we're presenting claims after we've decided which ones that we want to use, order and the wording does matter in terms of how you're persuading your readers, especially considering which claim that we present first versus which claim we end with. All of that goes into a strategy, especially in terms of how we're getting the audience to better understand where we're coming from, and of course, ending with them agreeing with the stance we're making. So with this, right, as a general guideline, when you're presenting claims in an argument, your first claim should be the most general and the easiest to accept for the target audience, especially because this serves as the entry into your argument. If you can get them to agree with you in the very beginning, even at like a really relatively small claim, right, that really can do a lot to reinforce that relationship you're building with that audience. So as you present more claims that may be more controversial to your audience's beliefs or opinions, they're going to be more likely to open up and listen to you because they agreed with that first claim. So that's why when we see arguments, most authors choose to begin with a claim of fact. And of course, typically it's like a smaller fact in order to begin and build that relationship. Right. As we kind of progress through this, when we're thinking about creating claims and like how they're flowing, right? If you were using claims of policy, usually the claims of policy would be in the later part of your paper. Any guesses as to why we would have claims of policy towards the end of the argument? Why would that be more beneficial at the end than at the beginning? Yeah, it shows the changes could be made. So ending with something that can be done, right? It can be really effective in motivating your audience at the end. And of course, before we can even get to a claim of policy, you need to convince them that there is a problem, which is why we wouldn't start with the claim of policy. That's why we would have claims of fact and claims of value first, so that they identify that there's a problem, and then now we can see what can be done, right? If we start with a claim of policy and they aren't acknowledging a problem, then of course it'd be easier for them to dismiss in terms of, well, we don't need to do that. So that's really important in terms of strategy here. And of course, thinking about how the claims are building. So regardless of the claim types, because of course you don't necessarily need to have all three claim types, right? You probably are going to have at least two of the three, depending on the argument that you're making, right? Really figuring out and looking at how they flow together. So one way that we can view this in terms of making sure the order of the claims makes sense is, as we're working towards this, especially as we're outlining, we want to look at the flow of them. So checking the flow really matters, especially in terms of seeing first, like, what is your thesis? How does claim 1 build from that? And then claim 3, claim 4, and then claim 5 and so on, depending on how many claims you have. So really seeing separate from your evidence kind of how they work together. So of course, as we are building the argument, very similarly to how like we would essentially, if we think of our intro, we would start broad and then narrow our focus, or our conclusion, we start narrow and then broaden, right? We would do a very similar thing. So our thesis would be narrow, but then after that, right, our claims would start as broad. And then we would slowly narrow our focus and make it more specific towards the end. So it becomes more specific as you continue to persuade that audience. So looking at them in order, kind of to see that scale, kind of can help you figure out where you may want to shift some if it's not necessarily, if it's too broad later on, or if it doesn't necessarily flow correctly. So that is really important to consider. Any questions about how we would word our claims, about kind of what things we want to consider? Or any concerns before I move on to argumentative thesis statements? Awesome. So moving on to argumentative thesis statements, right? Since the thesis is the main assertion that we're making as we present our argument, we do really want to be careful with how we're wording an argumentative thesis. And an argumentative thesis is probably the most important thesis statement that needs to be created, essentially. Primarily because the purpose is so wrapped up with the argument in general, right? We're not just explaining something, we are persuading. So we want to make it very clear what we want our audience to take away from this. And of course, guiding those readers. In most cases, right, when we're making academic arguments, we always want that argumentative thesis to be explicitly presented. There are very few cases in which we don't want an explicitly presented thesis statement. Typically, that would be when the thesis comes later in the essay, in the conclusion. But for the sake of our argument that we're making, we would still follow that similar intro ending with a thesis format, because of course we want our argumentative thesis to unify the entire paper and establish the purpose of each claim and piece of evidence as the readers are engaging with each of those individual body paragraphs. So because of this working as that guide, as the unifying force for all of our claims, we really want to make sure our argumentative thesis is as clear and concise as possible so that there aren't any questions as to what we want our audience to be taking away from each of the sentences that we're presenting after it. So when we think about argumentative theses, we have 4 specific characteristics that we want to make sure we're including so that our argumentative thesis statement is as clear and concise as possible. So the first characteristic is that we want our argumentative thesis to be focused and not too broad. So what that means is that we have narrowed our focus enough where each claim that we're presenting is sufficient at creating and persuading the audience to agree with that main assertion. So the broader the thesis statement, basically the longer the argument needs to be to fully address all of the concerns or issues that our opposition may have with what we're making. So it is really important, and that's why we've already started to narrow the focus. So if we think about what we've talked about in terms of gender roles, right? If you had to make an argument about gender roles entirely, then that would literally be a dissertation or multiple books. So by narrowing the focus as much as possible, we're making it more accessible, easier for us to address fully and focus on persuasion. So for instance, if we look at our example here, for the first one, we have technology helps society to flourish. So if we think about this being very broad, right? The reason it is so broad is because there are so many different technologies that could be addressed. Like, what technologies could fit into this thesis? What technologies would I have to address if I were making an argument that fits this? Because I want to make sure we need to cover every single one. Because it could be like computers, it could be cell phones, it could be manufacturing, internet, satellite, electricity, cars, right? There are literally millions of different types of technologies that I could argue about. So if I were to make this argument and I want to do it properly, I would have to cover all of them, which would take a really long time. So that's why I'd have to revise it to kind of make it more focused and make it more accessible. Because now if we look at the revised version, transportation technology has helped society to flourish by making it easier to access goods and to travel. So that revised version is clarifying that I'm only focusing on transportation technology. So what that would be cars, even bikes, scooters, planes, buses, etc. So I limited my focus so that my audience now knows before I even get to the claims that all of the claims are going to be focused on types of transportation. So now it's easier for the audience to be able to forecast and anticipate the claims that are going to be made and how they fit with that argument versus that first example where it could have gone in a million different directions. And our list that we've even kind of brainstormed is nowhere near complete. I've also narrowed the focus as to how it's helped society flourish, so accessing goods and travel. So now it's not just every type of flourishment, I guess you'd say. Now it's very limited, so it's just going to be focused on access and travel instead of, if we think about what could have been before. If I talk about society flourish, I could talk about communities, talk about education, talk about a million things, and now I've just narrowed it down completely. So it's something that you really want to consider. So if your thesis and your focus is too broad, how can we narrow that focus a little bit more? So it's a little bit more direct. So for instance, so our example we had earlier, so if you're making an argument about gender stereotypes, right, we could narrow that further if you would like to, right? So of course, if we think about gender stereotypes, we have like masculine, feminine stereotypes. If we think about like personality stereotypes, we think about occupation, we think about sexuality, etc. There's a million different gender stereotypes. So we would want to establish how we've narrowed the focus if we're not addressing all of them. I think the example we had before, I want to say it was Dan, your example claim, so companies, so that would be more occupational, right? Gender stereotypes, so really indicating in the thesis statement that which ones we're going to be talking about. So any questions about the first characteristic of a good argumentative thesis, or anyone kind of concerned that theirs is too broad and need help narrowing it down? Okay. So our second characteristic of a strong argumentative thesis is it's centered on a debatable topic. So we want to make it very clear in our thesis statement that we are engaging in a debate. So with this, right, it's primarily so that our essay is very clearly an argument and it's not an expository piece of writing. So once you've narrowed it down, you want to make sure that what you're addressing about that narrowed issue is debatable. So for instance, taking a statement like we use technology every day, which definitely in 2020 is not debatable at all. We are using technology right now. We would not have this class without technology. So of course, like this as a statement is something we want to avoid because it's not presenting an argument. So we would want to revise that to make sure that we are assessing part of that issue that is debatable, which could be whether or not like this is good or bad, or whether or not like what aspect of technology we're wanting to talk about. So I've revised it to technology has improved our ability to communicate with others, which is debatable. Because if we think about the perspective of improved, there is a lot of argument going on as to whether or not communication has improved or whether or not it's made communication worse. For instance, like if we think about what makes this a debate would be, right, the lack of contact or conversation with others. And that typically is stemming from the issue of like text and then even social media, right? More artificial communication. It's even debatable if we think about like the difference between written versus like oral communication, or even if we think about like social skills is often thrown here in terms of you're communicating with others, but when you're in person, people aren't necessarily developing the same social skills that they would have before. Okay, so there's a lot that can go in there, which makes it debatable. And our next characteristic, as we kind of get more specific, is the most important characteristic, in which it needs to have a very clear side and stance that's being taken within that thesis statement. So you can't just present both sides. You need to make it very clear which side of that conversation you're on. Essentially, this is another reason, like another important characteristic that avoids turning your paper into an expository paper where you're explaining, and focusing it more on an argumentative paper where you're just focused on presenting one stance and persuading the audience to agree with it. And of course, the more important reason, of course, is when you take a stance, that's when we can create claims, we can further that point. It really helps to make everything more cohesive versus if you are kind of trying to take both sides. So for instance, the example of technology has created many benefits and problems for society, right? So when you're emphasizing within that language benefits and, well, that is true, right? It's not clarifying where you're going with this. So we'd have technology has helped society to advance instead, which is very clearly just focusing on the advancement and not the problems that are being addressed. One thing to note when your thesis statement is taking a side, that doesn't mean that you can't use the rhetorical strategy known as prolepsis later on. So you can still acknowledge the opposition and kind of the other side of that argument. We just really want to clarify in our thesis that we are prioritizing and just wanting the audience to agree with this one stance, and that this one stance outweighs that opposition, or in this case, like the problems completely. So we want to make sure our stance is as clear as possible. And finally, our last characteristic is an argumentative thesis makes claims that will be supported later. So this, very similarly to previous thesis statements that we've written, we want to introduce how we're going to be making that argument, not just what side we're on. So including claims or even just key language within our thesis statement can really help to create that roadmap for your audience so they can identify your points more clearly. It also establishes that you are focusing on just these points. So if we think about narrowing your focus, that can really help to narrow your focus. So for instance, I can take that previous claim, technology has helped society to advance, and then I could indicate that how. So technology has helped society to advance because of how it has increased communication and production of goods that make life easier. So thinking of your arguments, right, we want to have all four of these criteria. Needs to be about a debatable topic. You need to take a stance, right? You need to indicate the claims that you're going to support later, and it needs to be narrowed. Excuse me. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple minutes and thinking of the argument that you're interested in making and thinking of these four different characteristics, brainstorm a thesis statement that would work. And then we're going to look at a few examples just to see how you're putting together your thesis statement that responds, presents a clear main assertion, and then follows these characteristics. So we're going to take about 5 minutes for this before we look at some examples, but any questions or any concerns before we do that? All right, so we're going to take 5 minutes. I'm going to mute myself and set a timer, and then we'll look at some examples.